Believe me, it is an honor for me to be with you today to discuss one of the top issues of the global political agenda and a top concern of citizens, both here in the United States and in Europe, how to better manage migration in the 21st century. Let me start by telling you that when I was designated Commissioner responsible for migration and homeland security, I could never imagine that in a very short period of only 5 months, these issues would be not on the top of the European, but of the global agenda. Some of my colleagues in the Commission said that I was the unlucky man. But between us, instead of living a boring life in Brussels, I prefer what I am doing, and we have done a lot during these last 3 years. Definitely we are not where we were before. You all know that we live in the era of human mobility, of global human mobility. More than 65 million people today are displaced. It's a big number. And more than 250 million more generally on the move. Our world is becoming more mobile, more globalized, and more interconnected. At the same time, however, our societies are becoming more fractured and more inward-looking, as if we have learned nothing from our recent history. Less welcoming and more suspicious of those that may be different. We have had an international economic crisis on both sides of the Atlantic. But this has not shaken the cohesion of our societies. No, it took the migration crisis and the question of migration and refugees to divide us, to start tearing at our social fabric. We are unfortunately all too familiar with the rise of populist and nationalistic discourse and its impact in elections over the past years. Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Italy most recently. Very worrying messages from the future of Europe. The migration issue has also been a very divisive issue here in the United States and still continues to be. We are confronted with similar challenges across the Atlantic. Europe and the United States have a long-standing historic partnership. A partnership that was built on common sacrifices, history, and shared values. The post-war international system, as we know it today, was built on those values. Openness, solidarity, responsibility, cooperation, and burden sharing. A commitment to uphold rules and norms on the basis of which we build international institutions to prevent backsliding to the darkness of our past. Despite the many things that are written or said in the media today about the relationship, we continue to be very much alike in the essence of our principles, in the fundaments of our democracies, and in the aspirations of our choices. Whether in Europe or here in the United States, our citizens long for the same things. They want institutions that protect, that ensure security, but also openness and tolerance, economic opportunities and freedom. During the last 3 years, this balance is precisely what we have been trying to ensure and uphold in Europe. To guarantee mobility and freedom, openness and tolerance, but not at the cost of our security and safety. The European Union, believe me, is a union of values which we want to uphold and protect. But in the midst of two parallel crises on migration and security, our actions had to become much more hands-on and operational. The major paradigm shift here was that this hands-on approach was not some kind of power grab from Brussels. It was a direct request, a direct demand of our member states. This is why strengthening and better managing our external borders, which was not the case before, has been a key priority for all of us. Strong and secure external borders are paramount to ensure, first of all, our internal security, to fight irregular migration, and to safeguard our internal mobility. The Schengen area in Europe is the largest cross-border and transnational area in the world, where you don't need passport controls at the borders. It's a great achievement. I still remember when I was a young student, just 30 years ago, when I went for the very first time to visit other countries in Europe, leaving Greece to go up to the United Kingdom, when I went back home, I had to have my passport replaced because it was full of stamps. And one day, 30 years after, suddenly, Europe became our common, open, and hospitable home. In other words, it is one of the greatest achievements of European integration in the past 3 decades. But this wonderful freedom has come under threat, under risk, because of irregular migration flows and recent terrorist attacks in Europe. Border security has become a major concern of our citizens in the European Union, something which I know is also shared by many American citizens here. I myself have been a proponent of better protected borders from the very outset, but not at any cost. We have to better manage and secure our borders, but this cannot come at the cost of our fundamental values of tolerance and openness. And believe me, it is a very fragile balance. We cannot and we shall never become a fortress Europe. It is far away from our philosophy and our historical experience. So the European Commission has taken a very firm position on that. Despite the pressure of populist movements. It is also true that 3 years ago, Europe was not prepared to deal comprehensively with the migration crisis and in parallel the continuous threat of terrorist attacks. Europe has had no idea of how to cope with this situation. No experience at all. Only some member states like Germany, for instance, or Sweden. The rest of the European countries had an experience in sending migrants abroad. Hundreds of thousands of millions are here in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. But this unprecedented phenomenon brought to Europe in front of a very complicated and difficult situation. As politician, I was the very first one to cope with this reality. And without any exaggeration, I would tell you that I started from scratch. But we are not where we were 3 years ago, definitely. But during these 3 years, we had to do a lot. And believe me, it was not easy at all. Thanks to our common European efforts over the past 3 years, we are now much better equipped today to do this. Thanks to this hard work inside the European Union, but also outside the European Union, irregular arrivals to Europe today are almost 30% below the number of arrivals in the year 2014. This was a year before the migration crisis even started. A first important principle in our efforts so far has been that we need to know who is crossing our borders, and we need to be able to refuse entry more effectively to those who pose a threat and return those who have no right to stay in the European Union. Because the principle is very clear. The ones who are in need of international protection according to international law will have it. But all the ones who want to cross irregularly and illegally the European borders, they know that they will be sent back home. In Europe, something that was not the case in the beginning of the crisis, we have established so-called hotspots in countries like Italy and Greece, which are key control points for both migration and security. Because in the beginning, the situation was totally out of control. More than 1 million people managed to cross the European borders. And of course, it was almost impossible for the national defense system of these countries to block their route. That was against the basic principle of the Geneva Convention. Incoming migrants right now, that was not the case before, are registered, identified, fingerprinted, and checked against security databases. We have also created in the meantime, and believe me, it wasn't an easy thing. I call it my baby, because there were a lot of strong reactions on behalf of member states. So we created a truly European Borders and Coast Guard. Now more than 1,700 European border and coast guards from all across Europe support the 100,000 national border guards of our common external European borders in place in regions like Greece, Italy, Bulgaria, and Spain. A rapid reaction pool of 1,500 border guards is also on standby in case of an emergency. So if something happens somewhere in Europe, in 24 hours, 1,500 people will be there to support the national border control authorities. Something that was not existing before. New security threats, such as the return of foreign terrorist fighters, also require thorough checks starting from our external perimeter. Since April, systematic controls take place at the external borders so that every person entering the Schengen area is checked against all European databases. The use of our databases is growing exponentially. We want to complement existing information systems with new ones to close all gaps. Let me share you one of my experiences. Believe me, it was very difficult to convince member states to cooperate and exchange information. You know, the deep state in Europe is still strong. In the United States, sometimes you don't call it European Union, you call it a bloc. The real power is not in the hands of the Commission. We are supposed to be the executive institution, the government of Europe. But the real power is in the hands of the Council. The leaders, or at the ministerial level, represented by ministers. I have been myself from the other side of the table, and that I have repeatedly said to my colleagues there, so I know how do they think. Sometimes they do not think in a European way. They think in a national way. And this is a ground where nationalism, unfortunately, can find an open door to come back. Member States have recently agreed, finally, on our proposal for a system to record the entry and exit of all third country nationals crossing our external borders, allowing us, for example, to better track overstayers in the future. We will also soon have our European ESTA, which was not existing before. So we take best practice from the United States, because the United States have a great experience on migration, because this nation is made by migrants. Legal and irregular migrants. I remind you that Silicon Valley did not start from an initiative of legal migrants, but of irregular migrants, who brought here their skills, their vision, their imagination, and they changed the world. So very soon, we shall have the European ESTA, we call it ETS, European Travel Information and Authorization System, which will carry out checks on all visa-free third country national travelers in order to detect those who might pose a security or migratory risk before they arrive, before they reach our borders. But it is not enough that we have all these information systems for borders, security, and migration. We also need to make sure that they are all interlinked and interconnected. This is why we have proposed at the end of last year to ensure the interoperability between all the European Union's information systems. And I'll go back to what I did before. The deep system still resists. Some of the countries in Europe, they have an old-fashioned way of thinking about national security. Yes, national security definitely is a national responsibility. But when you have to cope with migration and terrorism, they're both issues that transcend borders. And they have become global. The idea is that every bodyguard through the system, every visa, immigration, or police officer should have access to exactly the information they need when they need it. This, as you all understand, will be a game changer in the fight against terrorists hiding behind their identities. A second very important principle in our efforts has been our strengthened cooperation with third countries, our neighbors, and partners outside the European Union. We have stepped up our cooperation with Turkey, with the Western Balkans countries, and also with North and Sub-Saharan African countries. Thanks to our strengthened cooperation with Turkey, the arrivals in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, in Greece have drastically dropped. Despite whatever is written and said in the media, this cooperation continues to work to this very day. It worked even during difficult political moments for Turkey, and I'm referring to the failed coup d'etat. Thanks to our cooperation across the Western Balkan countries, the Western Balkan region, we have much less irregular border crossings and less migrant smuggling, though we remain vigilant. Our work in and with Africa, including with our international partners, such as the United Nations and the African Union, has also made a real difference on the ground and in the central Mediterranean. Numbers have gone down there. For example, in the last 3 months, our help has enabled 15,000 migrants to return safely from Libya to their home countries. We supported the evacuation of more than 1,300 refugees from Libya for resettlement. I have asked all the member states of the European Union to help resettle at least another 50,000 refugees in the coming 2 years, including from Africa. So far, member states have already pledged for 40,000 places. I was, my dear friends, in Niger recently, only last week. And I had a stopover in Libya. I met there with Interior and Foreign Affairs ministers of countries of the European Union, the Sahel region, West Africa, and North Africa, as well as international partners as the United Nations to discuss how to deepen and strengthen our cooperation in tackling migrant smuggling and trafficking in human beings. Because I want to be very clear on that. Smugglers and traffickers are worse enemies. We have declared a war against them. And we are determined to crack down on their networks because they are behind this phenomenon of our times. We have committed to strengthen our operational and judicial efforts in the region, but also to step up resettlements of the vulnerable people who are being evacuated from Libya to Niger. As you all understand, these are all very important steps. But they cannot happen alone, and they cannot happen ad hoc. This is precisely why we are investing so much in the international negotiations for the global compacts for migration and on refugees with the United Nations. My dear friends, migration is not only a European phenomenon. And 2 years ago, when I met with the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, in Brussels, I proposed, and he accepted, to hold an extraordinary General Assembly on migration in New York. And he did it. And at the same time, President Obama did something in parallel. A very important meeting. Leaders across the world met there, and they all accepted that we have to work together. Migration is not a regional, it's a global issue that needs global solutions. It is a global one, and it needs a global answer. This is why, and I want to be frank with you today, I deeply regret that the United States has pulled out of the global migration compact negotiations. I would expect exactly the opposite from the United States, because this great nation has a leading role to play on that. United States cannot go back to the era of isolationism. It was its historical destiny to play a global role. And this global role is defined by all these noble principles that gave birth to this great nation. Migration will increasingly be an inherent feature of our times. The question is not how to stop it, but how to better manage it for everyone. And for this, we need everyone on board. The third principle of our efforts in the past 3 years has been fairness. This is very simple. Mindful of the essence of the Geneva Convention, those who are in need of protection should be helped in every way possible. But those, I repeat it, who do not have the right, those who abuse our hospitality, those who have no right to stay, they should be returned. And this had been said very clear to all our interlocutors from this region of the world. I want, however, to note that the American and European contexts in this regard are not the same. The situation of the many undocumented immigrants in the United States is something that we do not have at this scale in Europe. Europe advocates for a human migration and asylum policy system where people who apply for asylum but don't receive it should be returned as soon as possible. Now, we are reforming our asylum system so that decisions are issued quicker and that no applicants remain in limbo of irregularity. We are also urging and assisting our member states to become better at implementing and really enforcing return decisions. This mandate is given to the European Borders and Coast Guard, and they have already started implementing it in a very successful way. We are also stepping up our cooperation with key third countries when it comes to readmission agreements. There we have a problem. Some of these countries, it's not the moment to name them, but it sounds strange. They don't want to take their nationals back. They don't even recognize their nationals. But it happens. We have found the tools to convince them. And I'm going to be very frank with you. Even conditionality can be used for that. You know that the European Union is the main donor in terms of development of all these countries. We shall continue helping these countries to develop, but they have to take their part of responsibilities in managing irregular migration. And we have good examples, like Niger, for instance, where I was last week, and I get to praise and commend the government of Niger, the poorest country in the world, but a responsible country. It's not the case with the other countries in the Sahel region. In addition to what I said before, I have proposed recently a reform of our visa system to facilitate mobility for legitimate travelers, but at the same time beef it up to detect those who are not. We also want to use our visa policy as a leverage for countries that do not cooperate well with us on return and readmission. My dear friends, one thing is very clear. The global challenges of the day necessitate building and strengthening alliances and strong partnerships. The European Union and the United States are natural allies. We cannot turn a blind eye to all these problems, which touch all of us in an equal way. Our only way forward is together. And populism, I repeat, populism is not the answer. Populism is parochialism and opportunism that can lead only to negative, if not dangerous, outcomes. Whether in Europe or in the United States, our citizens want our societies to be safe, but they also want them to remain open and free, legally, physically, ethically, and socially, because they are democratic societies. And democratic values should be defended, protected, and upheld. The truth of the matter is that whether we talk about protecting our borders, increasing security, or better managing migration, we have to acknowledge that no country anymore can do it alone. Europe and the United States, as I said before, have a long-standing history of cooperation. At times of instability and uncertainties, the world looks to us to show leadership and to continue safeguarding prosperity and stability across the globe with actions based on rules, principles, and values. We have a duty to continue working together to deliver these goals. This is why I wish to turn to the younger generations. The next generation that will inherit the transatlantic alliance and that will have to continue working for a better and safer world. You will agree with me that governments, administrations, elections, politicians come and go. But principles are there. And they will define the future of a new world under the circumstances I described before. But partnerships and alliances are built across generations, and they are shaped by the drive, ambitions, and openness of our youth. Because our youth today has taken all this achievement for granted. It was a gift of our generation to them. But they have a duty to carry out, to defend these values. Sometimes I say that Marx, I'm not a Marxist, had said that history repeats itself. No, it's a mistake. Men repeat history very simply because they don't read it. And this reminds me of the myth of Sisyphus from the Greek mythology. Someone condemned by ghosts to carry a heavy rock on his shoulders to the top of a hill, and when he was arriving there, the rock was rolling out again. Should we accept that it's the destiny of mankind? Of course not. We have a duty to carry out, reading and drawing lessons from history. And this is the message to the younger generations. At a time where everything is a FaceTime call or a WhatsApp message away, where traveling to the other side of the world takes 2 days at most. Not here because I still suffer from jet lag. It's a bit long. Young people already know that our challenges are global. Because the younger people of today, they can be patriots and citizens of the world at the same time. This is a revolutionary development of our age. Ultimately, the choice between national and global is a false one. You know better than, unfortunately, many politicians today who are looking inwards instead of seeing the larger global picture in front of them, that you can maintain and develop your identity and your community, that you can even be, as I said before, patriot, whilst working together global endeavors and solutions in partnership and shared values with others. And the main issues to which I referred before, mainly migration, global security, has directly to do with that. We live in a global community. We are, most of everything, this includes our generation, citizens of the world, and let's work together to make this world better and work on these basic principles upon which our civilization is built, mainly solidarity, responsibility, and historical duty for the next generations. Thank you very much for your attention.